As we're waiting for a few more people to roll in, I just want to talk about a few of the ground rules before we get into the actual programming. It looks like everybody is muted already and I don't hear any background noise, which is great. So thank you for that. If you would like to communicate, and we're going to have a quiz and we'll have some interactive parts of the session, please use the chat feature, and you can find that at the bottom of the screen. And if you do the chat for the entire class, that way we'll all be able to see. And when we do the quiz at the end of the class, this is also where you'll be typing your answers in there, and we'll go over that closer to the end. If you do have any questions as I'm going through, we will have a moderator, Max Spalkowitz. He'll be feeding the questions to me, and today is Ask Me Anything about tea. So of course, if something comes up throughout while I'm doing this introductory slideshow and some photos, or at any point, just type it in the chat box and we'll try to get to all your questions. I just ask, please be respectful in the chat box. I mean, we're all tea people here, so that shouldn't be a problem. And this session is going to be recorded. So if anybody would prefer to not appear in the recording, you can just click your video off, and that's fine. And just to get started, if anybody wants to type into the chat box now, test it out, let me know where you are, and if you're drinking tea, what you're drinking right now. It's always great to get an idea of what everybody else is enjoying. And then before we get into the actual photos and the intro to this summer camp programming, I do want to make an ambient brew. I'm going to start it now, and then we'll decant it closer to the end of the class. I don't know if you guys noticed on the reply email from Eventbrite, but I did send a recipe for ambient brew. If you happen to have this, great. If you don't, grab some loose leaf. I'm doing a 4-gram dose, which is about, for this Lapsang Souchong from Tongmu Village, it's about 1.5 tablespoons of dry leaf. And I'm going to put that in 1 cup of good tasting, just room temperature water. And it's a pretty complicated brewing method. I just dump the tea into the Pyrex measuring cup. You can use anything. You could use a mug that you were going to drink out of. And I'm going to set this aside for about 45 minutes, and then we'll taste it closer to the end of the class. So if anybody has tea, go for it, and let's check out ambient brewing later, because it's very fun to talk about tea, but it's much more fun to drink it. So again, welcome to everybody. This is the inaugural session of In Pursuit of Tea Summer Camp. And the idea behind this was we wanted to come up with a sort of less familiar range of programming in order to introduce people to tea, or for people who are more into tea, give them a different experience. There's a lot of tea educational information, classes out there. As we all are a little bit stuck inside still, we just wanted to come up with a way to help spread the knowledge. This was originally a class we conceived of doing in person, and it would have been limited to probably only 10 or 12 people. So I'm really thrilled with how many people showed up today. And I'm hoping some of you are registered for the other sessions, and maybe today you'll find out about another one that you would like to join. So again, welcome to everyone to IPOT Summer Camp 2020. I'm going to show you a few pictures and give you some background on Camellia sinensis for those of you who might be a little bit less familiar with tea. Oh, it's great. Thanks for all writing in and telling me what you're drinking right now. So let's get started. Okay. And here we are. This is a tea field in Wuyi, China. This is one of the first places that invented oolong tea and black tea, a really important area for tea production. And again, just a welcome to everybody. I think this is a much needed respite in these days. So tea is enjoyed all over the world, but especially in Asia, you see an appreciation for it that's a little bit, well, it just runs a lot deeper than here in the West. And part of what we're trying to do at In Pursuit of Tea, for those of you who might not be familiar with our tea company, is we're trying to introduce these traditional handcrafted styles of tea to a new audience. Again, the US has a lot of iced tea drinkers, chai, you know, matcha lattes, things like that. But you do find difficulty sometimes when you're trying to source just a straight, pure tea. And that's what we specialize in: unblended, unflavored tea, exactly as it's produced in these traditional areas of production, which we'll talk about in a second. And we want to just bring those to a new audience here in the West. These are an amazing collection of teapots from an amazing Wuyi oolong producer. Not only did he make fantastic tea, but he had a disturbingly large collection of antique teaware that I was afraid to touch. This is just one corner of the room. Again, this is in Wuyi in Fujian, China. So this is Southeast Asia. Again, not drawn to scale. This is just to give you a rough idea of where traditional tea is produced. When I say that, I'm referring to tea that is still hand-picked and hand-processed. So where we source from at In Pursuit of Tea are all the countries labeled on this map: China, Japan, India, Taiwan, and Sri Lanka. And also 2 newer regions found in Nepal and Bhutan, which you can see here in the Himalayas. And the 5 countries of China, Japan, India, Taiwan, and Sri Lanka are considered the core of traditional tea processing. These are the places where tea has been made for a very long time. And again, not all production there by any means is done this way, but you find the traditional production of hand picking and hand processing. The reason why that's important is because you're hand selecting for the best tasting part of the leaf. And if you can see, hopefully you guys can see my cursor on here. This is the bud of a tea plant. And this is a picture of Camellia sinensis leaves growing. They're about waist high, so they're pruned more into this bush type shape. And this picture was taken in April a few years ago. So even across those 5 countries I mentioned, it's a huge part of Asia. But you do see some general similarities with tea production. With the exception of Sri Lanka, most of these areas do have a winter dormancy period. So the plant is just hanging out. It's not really doing anything during the winter months, but then springtime, March, April, May, depending on where you are in those regions and your elevation, you'll start to see the new growth appear. And the buds and the tender new leaves, traditionally, even across different categories and different styles of tea, this is where the best flavor is. Now for traditional tea, this is why it tastes so much better than commercial or commodity grade tea, which is often mechanically harvested. It's a machine that just runs right over the top of the tea plant. That'll get the buds and the new growth, but it also gets leaves further down that don't have quite as good flavor, and maybe some stems or twigs. Some of it is sorted out, but you're never going to find the same concentration of ideal flavor as you will when you can hand select for those buds or exactly which part of the tea plant you want. It's a very labor-intensive process, but it does come out in the cup for sure. If you let the Camellia sinensis plant just grow naturally, it actually will turn into a small tree. And that's where this picture is showing you that it's from Guangdong province in China. This is southern China, and this is an area that makes a really beautiful style of oolong, the Phoenix oolongs. It's a really stunning mountain range. These plants are about 80 to 100 years old, and you can even see all the moss growing on them. Again, tea is grown over such a wide region. It's been enjoyed, depending on who you ask, anywhere from 2,000 to 4,000 years. So different styles have evolved, different ways of treating the plant, and also different ways of processing the leaf after you harvest it. In this region, it's thought that the older the plant, the more extensive root structure, helps pull minerals, nutrients, and a lot of elements that contribute to a more nuanced flavor in the leaf. So they leave the plants to grow into this tree form. They don't prune it to stay at that bush height that you often see. But as you might imagine, the older the plant, the lower the yield. And in this region, you could find some plants that are 200, 400 years old, with the price of the tea, of course, going up accordingly. Now, when you're making hand processed traditional teas, usually you're controlling the level of oxidation among many other factors, but you're either letting oxidation happen, letting it happen somewhat, or you're stopping it entirely. And this is where we get the distinction into different categories of tea, which I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with. But this picture is a great illustration of freshly picked leaf on the left. This is from Bhutan, and this is mid-processing of our Thunder Dragon green tea. This was the first day of harvest last spring. Luckily, we timed it just right. And what you see on the right here in the basket is leaf that has been pan-fired to stop the oxidation process here. And this is just a lineup. Now we're back in gritty New York City, not in beautiful Bhutan anymore, just to show you the range of oxidation that you see in the different styles of tea. And again, these are all made from this one Camellia sinensis tea plant, but how you treat the leaf after you harvest it, and more or less whether you're letting oxidation happen or not, is where, it's what determines where it falls into these categories. And the 6 major categories of tea are white, green, yellow, oolong, black, and pu'er, which is actually a subcategory of a larger group called heicha, or dark tea. And we have a class on that coming up closer to the end of July. Again, this is more of an intro, so I'm not going to go too deeply into these styles of tea. But if you have specific questions about these, feel free to start sending those over. And this lineup, again, from left to right, is roughly a scale of least processed, least oxidized, moving into more processed, more oxidized. And there's actually a chemical change that takes place that turns certain compounds in the tea into other ones. And with that transformation of oxidation, you actually see this darkening color. So you can even look at the liquor of the tea, at the color of the water, and you can determine what style of tea is this as you start to continue your own tea explorations. Of course, drinking tea is amazing. One of the really fun things about sourcing directly at In Pursuit of Tea like we do is just getting to see the terroir, seeing the overall geography of these regions, experiencing the weather, seeing the differences in elevation, how that can affect flavor, how it can affect the health of the plant. This is also the Phoenix Mountain regions on a particularly cool morning in the springtime, right when they were starting harvest there. There's of course the beauty shot of the Himalayas over Darjeeling town. My trip there last spring was the first time I saw the Himalayas. We were in a car and it went around a corner and I thought it looked like a backdrop. Everyone else seemed very nonplussed because they see this view all the time, but particularly striking. And then this is Darjeeling town underneath there. And we actually have a tea class on teas of the Himalayas coming up later in July as well, if that's a region of interest. So the roads are fun. Part of the journey, of course, yes, is flying to Asia, but the really fun part is driving to all these tea regions. The better tea in general tends to come from more remote regions, possibly because it's further away from cities, the air is cleaner, the water's cleaner, there's less pollution. But that means when you're sourcing, you're also traveling great distances over kind of some rough terrain to get to the tea farm. This is the road to lead to Thunder Dragon in Bhutan. And it is even scarier than it looks because you can't see the drop off there. This is the Arya Estate in Darjeeling, again, just to give you a sense of the scale. This actually is very close to where that picture of the Himalayas is. This particular estate is you drive down a really terrifying one-lane switchback to get to the farm. And I was really hoping when we got to it that the tea would taste good because the ride was so bad that you don't want to go on that huge ride and then have the tea not turn out that well. But they made a really beautiful first flush that we ended up getting. And again, it's all a process of controlling that oxidation because as soon as you harvest the Camellia sinensis leaf from the tree or from the bush, whatever style that particular farm is growing, it's starting to change and the farmer needs to deal with it immediately. So if you're a tea maker, you already know exactly what style of tea you're going to make because you need to have all the processes ready to go. The window between harvest and finished product is often less than 24 hours in most cases. So you really don't have a lot of time. And in some regions, you might be harvesting once a spring or once a season. So you really need to focus on getting it right. And this process is still done so much by hand. Any machinery that you do see in these traditional setups is built to emulate hand action, like a roller, maybe that used to be done by hand. It might be done in slightly larger batches with a machine roller, but it all comes down to the producer being able to pick up that leaf at all stages of processing and knowing exactly what to do. Do I let it oxidize more? Do I heat it? Do I roll it? Do I shape it? And this is something that they learn only through many, many, many years of experience. I gain a new admiration for this every time I'm over there because it's impossible to just sort of read a book or watch a video to know how to do it. It's something you really need to train for many, many years before you're able to build up the skills to be a skilled tea producer. This is some cupping just to show you the idea of comparing different lots. This is also Darjeeling First Flush. These are all from the same estate, the Singhal estate. And you might be dealing with lots that were produced on the same day, maybe a couple from the day before, maybe there's 3 lots from today or 7. And the idea is to cup them side by side and you're evaluating the leaf appearance. The aroma of the leaf is really important with traditional teas and of course, the flavor of the tea itself. And when you cup side by side, you maybe can pull out some certain favorites and then decide which lot or which lots you're going to purchase. You know, obviously flavor and fragrance are the most important for us when we choose for In Pursuit of Tea, but you also have to keep price in mind as well. And there's a huge range of prices for traditional teas. Remember, these are handmade, so there's a lot of labor that goes into it. But value is very subjective. So what I might think this is a great tea for $20 a pound or $50 a pound or a kilo. We do pounds, everyone else does kilos. You know, you have to keep in mind who's the audience for this. So we try to have a range of some more accessible teas, maybe that are newer production areas, newer styles, along with some really famous traditional styles that might have been made for hundreds or even thousands of years. Oftentimes those styles just can get quite expensive because they're really highly valued in Asia, so they command a fair price. So one of the other fun things, of course, taste teas, evaluate teas, select lots, but is just getting to travel around. You meet a lot of interesting characters. This was my first yak in Bhutan. She was friendly for a little while, but I didn't push it. And moved on, and this is actually the production area in Bhutan. So you can see the tea maker here. She's actually tossing those freshly harvested tea leaves in a hot wok. And this process of heating the leaf, they're making a green tea in this region. This is our Thunder Dragon green tea. Heat stops the enzyme that causes oxidation. So if you want to make a green tea, you need to have some method ready after harvest to be able to heat the leaf up to a certain temperature, enough to disable that enzyme that causes oxidation. And that's why the leaf stays bright green, and subsequently the color in the cup will stay quite green as well. But you can see done by hand, this takes a while, and that electric wok was quite hot. This is just to give you an idea of some of the ways that you can share tea. You know, it's wonderful. Of course, you're there in business, you're trying to select teas, but a lot of it is building the connections with the tea farmers and all the workers there. And this is tasting some beautiful first flush at the Singel estate. And of course, you always have to check out what you have with your tea. That's very important in each region to see what kind of cookies and other treats you can pair with your teas. And this, again, just a reminder about how much hard work goes into traditional teas. This is just an example of the plucking process. And it's a little hard to tell from this photo, but that is an extremely steep slope. And the path between the bushes, we're talking 6 to 8 inches. It looks all fun and idyllic when you're visiting, but it's a lot of hard work, even just to get that leaf from the plant into the processing facility, which is pretty much always located on the same farm, in order to deal with it, to either let it oxidize or not, depending on what style of tea that you're trying to make. And, you know, it's summertime. So again, a lot of us aren't thinking about hot tea right now, but I encourage you to think about tea outside. I know a lot of us are also stuck inside, unfortunately, but if you can find a little moment to get out, summertime is just such a wonderful, amazing time of year to have tea in nature. Just to explore different places to have it. You don't need to have a fancy setup, but I find even if you're not drinking tea at the farm with the producer, it helps connect you with the beverage in a whole different way. It really helps me focus on the fact that this is a plant, this is from nature. You know, again, with these traditional teas, nothing's been added to them. All the amazing flavors and fragrances are just naturally inherent in the leaf, but it's the skill of the producers at bringing these out. Yeah, drink more tea. This is a cold brew that I made recently. You can make many different styles of tea. We do have a cold brew brewing class next week. We have some more tips on hot brewing coming up this Thursday. I'm not really going to cover too much about brewing today, but I know this is a question a lot of people are interested in. But again, whenever you can have tea outside, I encourage you to try it. It doesn't need to be anything fancy. Okay. So now, if we can get into the Q&A period. Let's see if you guys have sent some questions in. Oh, great, there's a lot in here. Let's see. I see a couple.
Hey, Anna.
Hi.
This is Max from the IPOT team as well. I'm unmuted now, so I can send you some questions from folks because I've been keeping track. People were asking before about where yellow tea and red tea fall into the tea category spectrum and how red tea can have different meanings depending on what exactly you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Sort of different questions. So let's talk about red tea first. And I see a few people had asked about that. So red tea can mean rooibos, which is a plant that's native to South Africa. It gets its name from the Afrikaans word, just rooibos, which translates to red bush. And you might have seen it. It almost looks like very thin little stems, and it has a really deep, beautiful crimson color. Now, this is a plant separate from Camellia sinensis, so it's naturally caffeine free. Remember, any of the teas in those 6 categories, and we'll talk about yellow in a second, white, green, yellow, oolong, black, pu'er, heicha, all Camellia sinensis, they all have caffeine. Anything that's outside of that, if it's not made from the Camellia sinensis plant, we call an herbal. Often in the US, we call it herbal tea, but we try to discourage the use of that word and keep tea just for those 6 categories, just for things made from Camellia sinensis. So rooibos is an herbal or an infusion. Tisane is another way to say it. You can also see red tea used to refer to what we in the West call black tea. I don't have a good example right here, although maybe I can show you one of the lapsang leaves that I'm using to brew. You guys can see. The leaf looks, it's a tiny leaf, but the leaf looks black. So the lapsang souchong is a style of black tea in which the leaf's allowed to fully oxidize. The Europeans looked at the dry leaf and called the category black tea. For green tea, the leaf looks green. For the dry leaf, they called it green tea. In China, of course, where this has been made for many thousands of years, just tea in general, they're naming the tea based off the color of the liquor. So when you brew a black tea, the color looks red or reddish. So if someone maybe who has a Chinese background or is from China is asking you, oh, I'd like red tea, they're probably referring to what we in the West might call a black tea. So very confusing. Usually you can figure it out though if you ask a couple questions afterwards.
People were also asking about first flush Darjeeling, and is it a black tea? Is it an oolong? Is it none of the above? Where would you classify it?
We could do a whole class just on just on first flush. First flush is actually a category sort of unto itself. We categorize it under black tea just for ease of people being able to find it. But it's important to know, to back up a little bit, the flushes refer to different harvests. So first flush just means the first harvest or first picking of those leaves, again, after a winter dormancy period. Now, first and second flush, we're referring to the ones in Darjeeling. Some other regions might use this terminology, especially in India, of first or second flush. But do know it does not refer to quality. Maybe you might prefer one over the other, but first doesn't mean first, like the highest grade. Second doesn't mean a grade below it. It's referring to the time of harvest. First flush usually takes place around April, but again, it all depends on what elevation you're at in Darjeeling. It ranges from about 1,000 to 6,000 feet. So lower elevation farms might be ready earlier, maybe even late March. I was somehow lucky enough to taste some very early first flush from a low lying estate in Rohini in February before everyone got locked down. So I was like, I just have to hold on to this flavor to last me until now that we've got some 2020 tea finally coming in. But for first flush, it's harvested and it's allowed to go through a really unique process called hard withering. And if you might remember that picture I showed you in the slideshow where the leaves were laid out on that long tray in this sort of endless stream, basically they're allowed to lose a lot of moisture very rapidly. And this is a way of treating the leaf that you don't really see in other categories. Some people liken first flush to a white tea or an oolong because there is just a little bit of oxidation in there. And if you are familiar with first flush and look at the leaf, there's a lot of green in there, but you'll see some darker pieces. When you brew it, it tends to be quite light in color. So it's this sort of weird category. Second flush, which is picked usually in May after the plant has had a time to regenerate the buds and then new tender leaves. Second flush is processed more like a black tea, allowing that full oxidation to happen. So I find people in the West at least are more familiar with second flush. First flush, maybe they've tried. Because of that hard wither and because it's not as fully oxidized as a second flush, it does tend to be a little bit lighter and I'd say much more floral. A lot of what first flush is about is the fragrance. Of course you want the tea to taste good as well, but I find the people who prefer first to second flush, that's usually what they're after. So if you're into white teas or green teas and you're not usually a sort of darker black tea drinker, I encourage you to try a first flush sometime. It might surprise you how light sort of black tea can be, but really it should be in its own category. Again, this is something that'll be covered in the Teas of the Himalayas session a little later in July, but First Flush actually was only developed in the 1980s. So it's a very new style of tea. And if you want to find out why, take that class, because I really could talk about it for another hour. So we'll move on to another question.
We had a question about pesticides. Do small producers use them? How can you check for pesticide use?
Yeah, first of all, I would be very wary of, if you ever hear someone say that they can taste the pesticides, I don't really believe that's true. I mean, as a company, what we're trying to source are teas that are sustainably made as cleanly as possible. And because we go to the farm, you get a much clearer picture of what's actually happening there, as opposed to, okay, you know, here's the bag of tea, it's got organic stamped on it, fair trade, all these things. That's important, and I'm not saying that that's not valid, but we don't necessarily pick a tea that is certified organic, or that you say there's absolutely no pesticides. The reason being, yes, we're very concerned with sustainability, but if a farmer has to spray a certain area of the tea farm in order to save an entire crop, you know, as long as they're still treating the plants well and they're concerned with the sustainability of the farm, we're okay with that. The other fun thing about sourcing, and because we're such a small company, you know, we're not buying thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds, like container loads of tea. So we tend to be focused on smaller lots. And again, you really have a bigger, like a better picture of the entire process from start to finish, because you actually go to the farm, and quite often you stay at the farm. These areas are so remote, there's no luxury hotel or anything, but if you like tea, then you're fine, because you're in heaven just drinking it from sun up to sundown, and usually after that as well. So yeah, it's important, we monitor it. But I'd say at the end of the day, you know, we're only sourcing teas that we drink, and we drink a lot of it. So we feel, you know, comfortable and safe drinking these. But yeah, it's something to be concerned about. And I'd say whoever you're buying your tea from, the vendor or the producer, you should be able to ask them, what's the situation on your farm? And if they can't answer you, that's not a good sign.
We had a good question here about, do producers ever make 2 or even 3 types of, say, green tea, or do they only stick to one particular type?
It all depends where you are. Again, considering tea's long history, some styles have been made for literally thousands of years. In general, the longer the tea has been made in a certain region, I'd say the more adherence, I meing, I guess you could argue against this, but usually the more adherence you'll see to that particular style, often because it's built up such a value over centuries. Longjing or Dragonwell is a perfect example. You know, the real high quality tea that's made only in a certain region, only at a specific time before the spring rains come, there's such a value attached to that tea domestically in China that you wouldn't really want to experiment necessarily unless you had, you know, you have money to burn to say, oh, I'm going to try and make a black tea, or I'll try and make something else. Usually you make what your parents made and what your grandparents made and your aunts and uncle make, because they're the ones who you learned from when you were young. Again, I mean, I'm generalizing here. With tea, there's never one answer that applies to every single style. But I'd say it tends to stay the same in areas. Of course, now you see in Japan, which makes primarily green tea, some tea producers are like, I want to do something different. Or maybe the audience in Japan, maybe younger people are like, I don't want to drink sencha. I don't want to drink steamed green tea, because that's what my grandparents drink and it's boring. I want Earl Grey, you know, or I want black tea. So you will see some regions trying newer styles. But for the most part, for these long-standing traditions, they're making the same styles that have been made for many generations. Did that answer the question?
I think you answered the question. There was a question asking for a little more explanation of the yellow tea process, because that's not very well, it's not very widely discussed.
Absolutely. So as I mentioned really briefly, yellow tea, it's almost a subcategory of green tea, and it's hard to find, partially because it's fallen out of favor, just in terms of its popularity, but also because it's more difficult to make than green tea. So with a green tea, again, I know we covered this really quickly, but you pick the leaf and you heat it to a certain degree in order to denature the enzyme that will cause oxidation. If you picked the leaf and you did nothing to it, eventually it actually would turn into a black tea, because oxidation is just this natural process of decay. With yellow tea, the leaf is picked and it's pan fired slightly lower than the temperature you need to denature that enzyme. So you're left with a leaf that looks a lot like a pan-fired traditional Chinese green tea, but then it's removed. It actually, the type we source, the Anhui yellow, it's made by a very skilled producer, Mr. Dai, and he moves it from one wok at one temperature to another, and then onto a bamboo mat that's almost like a cone or sombrero shape, and that's actually placed over charcoal embers. It's not like a roaring fire, but it's a fire that has been dying down. And what happens is the charcoal slowly filters up through the bamboo, and the tea leaves absorb the scent. So tea is incredibly sensitive to its environment. It'll absorb the scent of anything that's nearby. The leaves sit on those embers for a day or two, and they're gently moved, not constantly, but you do need to shift the leaves around to make sure that they're absorbing the charcoal aroma at the same rate. And what you're left with is a tea that's really surprising, again, especially if you're a green tea drinker. It has those kind of classic sweet, nutty characteristics that you find for a Chinese tea, but then you have this amazing, really delicate smoke charcoal note. It's an aroma, but it's also a flavor, kind of hits in the back of your palate. I find it adds a depth that makes it sort of like green tea, but with a little bit of this charcoal added to it. I really encourage you guys to try the Anhui yellow if you haven't. It also has more staying power than a green tea. Many teas, and again, this will be covered at the class on Thursday on brewing techniques, steep the leaves many, many times. There's usually always flavor in there with these traditional teas, with the second brew, third brew, fourth brew. Usually with green teas, you wouldn't take them through that many infusions, but with the Anhui yellow, the extra processing there gives it a depth. It can last, I'd say, up to 5 or 6 infusions, depending on how you're brewing it. Yellow tea, again, hard to find because people aren't as interested in it. And for the producer, they have to make a choice. Do I pan fire this leaf and then sell it immediately? Or do I pan fire the leaf almost to the level I need it to, and then have to do this multi-step, longer process to produce a style of tea that maybe is even harder to sell? Especially, it's really not known in the West, but Westerners love, is it green? Is it organic? Give it to me. So, it's based on demand as well.
So first, Jade, who asked the question about tea growers making multiple types of tea, said your answer was great, so you can rest assured. Second, Chris asks if there's a correlation with altitude to stressing the plant roots like there is with wine, and what does that do for the resulting tea?
There is a correlation, but it doesn't, you can't sort of make a blanket statement and say higher elevation or more stressed tea leaves equal better flavor or necessarily this flavor. Remember that region I showed you of Asia, that's a huge area we're talking about for traditional tea production. So the individual terroir, the elevation, the soil content, the weather patterns, that's all going to have a huge effect on the final flavor of the leaf, and what the farmer is able to extract what's naturally inherent in that leaf. Elevation, there's plant stress going on, but it's a little different from my very limited understanding of wine, which is pretty much if it's white and cold and in a glass, I'm like, oh, it's delicious. And it's a little different than coffee, where I do believe there's a correlation between elevation and quality. With tea, it all depends what region are you in, what style are they trying to make. Often you see with elevation, and what comes to mind just off the top of my head are Taiwanese high mountain oolongs. Taiwan is a subtropical island off the coast of Fujian. It's very warm and hot, at sea level. But as you go up in elevation, there's a mountain chain that runs straight down the middle of the country pretty much. You start to notice the vegetation changes. The palm trees turn into pine trees, and it's also much cooler in the morning. You might get fog and mist and clouds. So the plants are shielded from UV exposure in the morning. And remember, you're at maybe 5,000, 4,000 feet elevation. UV is much stronger there. The plants are shielded from it in the morning, and then maybe the clouds tend to burn off in the afternoon. We're talking again springtime or fall, or the big seasons there. So it's more that temperature shift that you see at elevation that's going to bring out some of these interesting qualities. That it depends on the skill of the producer to be able to kind of capture those. But the plant does go through some stress at elevation, possibly, again, to generalize, more than it would if it was at sea level.
So Fran was asking, Tieguanyin, Phoenix Mountain, and Wuyi oolongs all seem so different. What makes them oolong?
They're also delicious too. Those are some of my favorites. Oolong is a really interesting category. And again, I know I only just really briefly touched on this when I was talking about the different categories of tea, the 6 categories. Remember, oolong is that interesting category between green and black. Green tea being unoxidized, black tea being fully oxidized. Oolong is anywhere in the middle. So that's a great question, because you realize you can have a huge range of oxidation in there, 5%, 10%, 30%, 70%. And subsequently, that'll have a huge effect on what the final flavor is, the appearance of the leaf, the appearance of the liquor, but also the flavor. Lightly oxidized oolongs tend to be a little bit more floral and maybe a little bit like creamy or buttery, because there's less oxidation that's happened. With oxidation, you start to notice changes that lead you into the more earthy, like nutty or more roasty side. And roasting also, it happens with many tea categories. Oolongs do have a long history of going through roasts, and maybe different styles sometimes get roasted, sometimes don't. Roasting would happen after the tea making process has been completed, and that can add another layer of flavor. We actually have a Taekwonyin deep roast available right now that's sort of this older style of Taekwonyin. Quite often now, Taekwonyin is made in a much greener style. It's not allowed to oxidize as much. It's fine, but I really like the old stuff. I just think that particular plant variety, because Camille sinensis, yes, they're all made from this one Camille sinensis plant, but there's different varieties of the plant you can use that might be more suited to a certain oolong or white tea. And Taekwonyin is actually made from a variety called Taekwonyin, nice and easy to remember. It used to be very heavily roasted. So we have a deep roast version that's actually made in Taiwan that really is reminiscent of this sort of old man style that you used to find in Anxi in China. But yeah, you're right. Oolong, I mean, it's hard to say, because you could probably make this argument about the heicha or pu'er category. Oolong probably has the widest range of flavor and fragrance. If you just focused on that category, you'd probably never be bored, because you can find such a huge range in those levels of oxidation.
Jeffrey was asking if you could share a few words about chai. What is it? What makes chai chai? How does it vary from place to place?
Traditionally, it's from India, and it's a blend of black tea with milk, can have a sweetener or not, and often it would be whatever spices happen to be in your area. There's no one recipe or formula, like chai has to contain ginger, cardamom, cinnamon. There's many different regional variations. We actually do have a chai class coming up on the 14th of July, so that if you're really interested in chai, I encourage you to check that out. Because chai, believe it or not, it's not that old of a drink. I think a lot of things with tea they're very ancient and mysterious, but chai is a much more modern style. It's one of the ones, I'd say, at least personally, I do enjoy adding milk and sugar to chai to sort of get a different experience with the leaf. Pretty much everything else I have straight up. But with chai, I'd say just important to know there's no one chai and there's no one right way to make it, but traditionally would have black tea, milk, sugar, and then some spices. So if you make it at home, however you're doing it, I'd say keep going with that.
And then Jenny was asking about bug-bitten, aphid-bitten teas. What are they? Why do we want bug-bitten tea?
Sure. This is a really interesting question. So Darjeeling Second Flush, not the first, and Oriental Beauty are two styles of tea that have this little leaf hopper, jacid or aphid, that actually nibbles on the edge of the leaf. Now, again, we're dealing with a Western audience primarily, and I don't want to put bug-bitten tea on the website because I think people will be like, I'm not going anywhere near that. But what happens when the bug bites the Camilla sinensis leaf while it's still growing is the plant sends out chemicals to ward off this pest attack, because it knows, okay, something's affecting my growth and my survival. What happens in this chemical change actually translates when you produce tea, especially with the process of oxidation, into an incredible honey-like sweet and just really deep aroma. The flavor, a beautiful flavor as well. But if you do like sort of those deeper honeyed notes, try a Second Flush and an Oriental Beauty side by side. And again, whatever ones you have, or buy a couple different ones to play around with it. But it's interesting to have those side by side. They're separated geographically, by thousands of miles. They're from completely different areas historically in terms of tea processing. but you kind of taste the bug bitten notes in there. There's a few other styles that have the bug bitten, but those two, Darjeeling, Second Flush, and the Oriental Beauty, are the most famous for sure. Bugs are good sometimes.
And then Rachel was asking, what is purple tea? Is it a particular style or a type of processing or something else?
I have some, but it's in my cabinet, so I can't run get it now. I believe it's not Camellia sinensis, but I have to double check on that. It's this style. It's from China, but it brews up. I just don't remember the botanical name of it. Sebastian might know. It brews up almost a lavender color. I only have a little bit of it. I don't know. I'm just saving it for the next pandemic or something when I really need to pick me up. Flavor-wise, I wouldn't say it's the most interesting, but there is this particular one I'm talking about. There is a purple tea variety of Camellia sinensis. I know that is, I believe it's native to Kenya and African tea producing regions. We don't source from Kenya, so I'm not as familiar with it. But I believe it's a variety of Camellia sinensis that evolved this darker color to counteract for the UV. You know, the light is so strong, the plant develops this different coloration in order to deal with that. And it's found a few other places as well.
So continuing the questions of name a tea, what are GABA teas? Judy wants to know.
We can get, I'm not a huge GABA tea drinker. They're from Taiwan. It's dealing with the process that basically bumps up a certain amino acid that's found in the leaf. A lot of times you're playing around with how much oxygen is in the environment when you're producing the tea. There's reputed to have a lot of health benefits, which is great. But part of the reason, aside from the flavor, that I'm not as personally into them is because I find people sometimes can focus too much on, oh, this is really good because it's got this antioxidant in it. And people focus on that so much that they're not paying attention as much to how the tea actually tastes. And I think, again, in the West, we don't have as strong of a tea tradition, but if you view it as I have to drink this green tea because it's good for me, I want the whole process to be enjoyable. So if you love GABA teas and you like them for their flavor, great. But if you're looking more for, well, I've heard these ones are really good for me, which is just something I've heard from a few different folks, I'd say try it, but do know remember all the categories of tea, all the styles are from Camellia sinensis. It's a plant, it's got lots of good chemicals in it, you know, that are good for you. Nothing that's been proven definitively to say if you drink tea, you'll live forever. But I think if humans have been drinking it for 4,000 years, it's probably pretty good for you.
Ellen was curious about where jasmine pearls fit into the tea categories.
Sure. Traditionally, it's a green tea from China. And what's interesting about the traditional form of jasmine pearls, they're actually hand rolled one at a time. So if you've ever had them, you'll gain a whole new appreciation for them. The green tea is made in early spring, pan-fired traditional Chinese green tea. Fujian province is a big area where this tea has been made, but flower-scented teas for hundreds or even thousands of years have been enjoyed traditionally more in northern China, around the Beijing area. Some people think that's partly due to the water content there. The floral scented teas do really well. But traditional jasmine, like what we have for jasmine pearls, it's hand-picked, it's pan-fired, and that Chinese green tea is actually set aside to wait for the jasmine harvest. Jasmine comes out a little bit later in the spring or early summer, and the producer would then get jasmine blossoms, go to believe it or not, there's a jasmine market, you know, that you can go to in some regions. It's like the fish market, but you pick the best looking jasmine and you actually buy it before the buds. They've been harvested off the vine, but they haven't quite opened yet. You get the jasmine, you bring it back to the tea, and you intermingle the tea with the flowers overnight. So jasmine is a night blooming flower, and even after you remove it from the vine, it's biologically programmed to open at night and release its essential oils. And what happens with these traditional jasmines, since the flower is sitting right on the tea leaves, the essential oils are released and the tea just absorbs that natural floral aroma. So you actually get this incredible, you know, really sweet flower note, but the base tea has to be well made as well. And you can have jasmine that's scented for 1 night, for 2 nights, for 4 nights, for 7 nights. We tend to buy one from a producer that's scented 5 nights, but not consecutively, because keep in mind, we're talking spring, summer, In different areas, of course, this is a really volatile time of year weather-wise. Maybe it rains for 3 days straight and you can't harvest the jasmine flowers. So the producer might have to wait a week or two to get 5 nights worth of scenting with fresh jasmine blossoms every night. Oh, and a wonderful thing I just found out, a new producer for us last summer shared with me, you can actually hear the jasmine flowers open at night. He said, you're sitting there and it sounds like popcorn, and all the flowers start to pop open. And I was like, I never thought of flowers having a sound. They're usually pretty quiet. But again, that's traditional jasmine. There's so much jasmine tea on the market here in the West. A lot of it could be artificially scented, or you could just spray it. It could be, jasmine essential oil, but it's much quicker and easier just to spray scenting over the leaves. Jasmine is our only scented tea that we carry, but again, we're trying to adhere to the traditional way of making it. So it is a really beautiful base tea, and just with those jasmine flowers added for the aroma.
Earlier, Manjit was asking, does IPOT offer tours?
We have in the past. We don't have any specific plans for it right now, but I do promise if we bring that back, and if this crazy situation we're in ever ends, we would definitely post it on our website and on social media, because I would say, yes, you need to go to these places to experience the tea firsthand. It really adds to your enjoyment. And even if you can't speak the same language as the producer, just sitting there drinking the same tea, I mean, you can sit there for hours, and it's really mind-blowing to realize how much work goes into these traditional teas. We're just the vessels. We're just trying to make it available to a new audience, but I'm floored whenever I go, just to see just the skill and the dedication it takes to make these teas. I want to pause the questions just because I'm actually keeping an eye on the time for once. I would love, if anyone's doing the ambient brew, now is a great time to decant it. I don't know if you guys can see this, but this is my, oh great, I see a couple in there. This is my Lapsang Souchong, and I'm just pouring it through this little gourd strainer into a glass. This is a really interesting way of making tea. Obviously, we're used to traditional methods of tea with hot water. Like that's what's going to be explored in Thursday's class. In next Tuesday's class will be cold brew and iced tea methods. This is sort of in between those. It's ambient brew. So it's just keeping the water at room temperature. This is a black tea, but you can see it brewed up fairly light. It's steeped for about 45 minutes. And the reason I picked the Lapsang for this particular class was that I find a black tea ambient brewed can be very eye-opening. It really shows you the inherent sweetness of the Camellia sinensis leaf, even in its fully oxidized form, which again, with black tea, I think a lot of us are more used to that kind of very like palate-filling, sort of intense astringency. But this shows you kind of the more delicate side of it. So I encourage you, any tea, you can try it. Again, about 4 grams if you don't have a scale. I'd say around a tablespoon, maybe a little more, a little less, depending on how dense your leaf is. Let it sit in a cup of water for 45 minutes and see what you think. The other fun thing is you can actually keep these leaves, because again, when you're really nuts about tea, you do stuff like this and you can't throw away tea leaves. You can steep these again, and you can steep it cold, or you can even use this for a hot cup of tea. You could use it today, you could use it tomorrow. I always encourage people, no matter how you're brewing, always try a second round or one last round. Eventually the leaves will release all they have to give and it'll taste like water, but always good to check it out. Does anyone like the ambient brew? Let us know in the chat. Let us know if it's surprising. Okay, good. But now I do want to go through our quiz as promised. We have some amazing prizes that I will show you. All the quiz answers, if you guys can type it into the chat box, and if you put the number of the question and then actually do type out the letter and the answer, I think it'll make it a little easier for us to track. If you do, Max will announce, okay, you're the winner of this particular question. Please do private chat Max Falkowitz to give him your information, your name and your email, because sometimes the Zoom names don't match up. The first question prize will be 3 free loose leaf samples of your choice. So again, if you win the first question, let Max know, or I'll get in touch with you, and I'll find out your address as well. The second prize for the second question is a box of tea bags. Really nice to have tea bags. You can tuck them into your bag or your pocket. Not that any of us go anywhere anymore, but always good to have your tea around, and you can pick the flavor. The third question prize will be this lovely History of Tea towel, hand illustrated by Wendy McNaughton for Sebastian's Little Book of Tea. It won't be as wrinkled as this. I actually used this one. I was wearing it in my hair earlier today. And then the fourth question prize will be the much sought after In Pursuit of Tea t-shirt. I've modified mine by cutting off the sleeves, but we'll send it to you with the sleeves on. You can decide with the little In Pursuit of Tea logo on the back. And again, if you win the t-shirt, just let us know what size you want, and we'll get your address and everything like that. So without further ado, let's move into the quiz, and everyone, you can type your answers just right into the chat. One moment. Okay. Okay. So where was tea first produced? And here are the choices: Laos, Japan, Assam, or Yunnan. And I think, Max, can you determine who's first?
Yeah, do you want to do them one by one, or?
Yeah, I can move on to the second one as long as we're set with the first.
All right, so the very first one is Erin, lowercase e, chimed in correctly with Yunnan.
Oh, great. Congratulations, Erin. This one's an interesting question, though. I just wanted to back up a little bit on it. I was playing around a little bit, and I thought, you know what? You actually could accept Laos or Assam as an answer. Because again, that Camellia sinensis plant was first growing in the area of Yunnan, southern China, Assam, Laos, all these borders that now exist. But of course, the Camellia sinensis plant didn't care what was where. But you could say that tea originated in any of those regions. Okay, so on to number 2. What determines a tea's flavor? Is it terroir, oxidation level, plant variety, or all of the above?
And we have uppercase Alex correctly chiming in with D, all of the above.
Great, you guys are fast. This is fast for a hot day in June. Yeah, all these factors are really important. I know we talked a lot about oxidation today in determining tea categories and tea flavor profiles, but terroir, of course, plays a huge role. And which specific type of Camellia sinensis or which plant variety can also affect the final flavor. So you see, even just from this overview, how many factors, again, the producers have to control to be able to produce a really good tasting cup of tea. Okay, so ready for number 3. Which one of the following does not contain caffeine? Darjeeling Second Flush, Rooibos, Thunder Dragon, or Assam?
And the very first winner is Rachel Kumar.
Okay, with Rooibos.
Congratulations, Rachel.
Yeah, so again, remember, sometimes you see Rooibos called red tea, especially in the West, it's been marketed that way. But again, it's from a different plant than Camellia sinensis, so it naturally just does not produce caffeine. It's not decaf, it's just a plant that doesn't produce caffeine. And for the final question, this one's a little tough, but you guys seem pretty quick. On this map, you see 3 different regions numbered. If you name one, you have to name all 3 where they are.
And Fran is the winner here with Taiwan, Japan, and Sri Lanka.
Great, good job. I didn't pick the easy ones. China, India are usually pretty apparent because they're the 2 biggest tea producing countries, and also they're quite large here on the map, but that's great. Again, these are the regions that we consider traditional because they have this long history of making these hand-picked and hand-processed styles of tea. Great. Thank you guys for participating in the quiz. It seems like everybody chimed in pretty quickly, so we'll make the questions harder next time. And we're getting close to the end, but if anyone else has a last minute question, I would like to again mention we have 7 classes coming up starting this Thursday, brewing techniques, if you want to dig into that a little more. Each one does have much more of a specific focus, but we're trying to find areas that maybe weren't necessarily as explored. So it's not just a tea 101 or make your own chai blend. It's let's dig into the history of these places. The final class will actually be a tea and wine tasting on the 23rd, which should be really fun. So pairing tea with a beverage, you know, that I feel is really well respected and that people, you know, they really highly value it, especially in the West. So let's put tea on that same platform as there and see if we can appreciate it on the same level. Any other last minute questions?
Yes, Ellen is asking, when you re-steep the leaves, do you get less caffeine from the subsequent brews?
You do, but caffeine is a very tenacious chemical. So even after, I've seen studies, again, it all depends how you're steeping. More leaf, hotter water will extract more caffeine. Caffeine's water soluble. But keep in mind, you could steep those same leaves 3 times, 7 times, 10 times, you're still extracting noticeable levels of caffeine even on that 10th infusion. It goes down for sure with each infusion, but you will, caffeine I find also is really particular to your own body chemistry. If you're very, very sensitive to caffeine or allergic, you really do need to stick with an herbal, something that doesn't have caffeine. There's this myth around that you can steep tea for like 30 seconds or a minute, dump it out, and then continue infusing those leaves and you won't, it removes like 90% of the caffeine. It's not quite that much. There's still noticeable levels in there, and if you are sensitive to it, you will perceive it. But if you're, you know, not allergic, but you maybe want to cut back, I'd say re-steeping the leaves is actually a great way to extend your tea drinking session, and you're not going to be taking in as much caffeine as if you started with a fresh cup, you know, and you did 5 different teas right in a row. Maybe take that one tea and infuse it 5 times. It all depends. Again, this is something that'll be covered much more in the brewing class on Thursday. But if you, in general, you probably find you need to leave the water on longer for subsequent infusions to get flavor. Caffeine will still drop even though the water is on longer because, again, some of the caffeine has already been released in the earlier infusions. But yeah, caffeine's intense. I think that's part of the reason why people have enjoyed this beverage for so long, and when they found the plant and they noticed the effect it had on them, why they took it with them all throughout Asia when tea first started being made.
And I think that wraps about the questions that we have from the crowd here. And people are loving the ambient brewed tea.
Good. Yeah, sometimes when it's this hot too, it's just nice not to heat up water, you know, to just have something that's room temperature. If you guys have any other questions, either about what we talked about today, questions about future classes, you can also email info@inpursuitoftea.com. As you can probably tell, I can talk about this all day, so I'm happy to answer any other questions you might have about tea. You know, I just think it's important that those of us who enjoy this beverage share it with other people and share the information as well. All right, well, thank you guys so much. I'm so happy that so many of you signed up for this. I hope you guys learned a little something new, even if it's just the new ambient brewing technique. And hopefully we'll see you at some of the other summer camp sessions. Stay healthy, everybody.